Hi everyone, welcome back to How to Revise Your Manuscript series. Today's workshop is honestly one of my favorite parts of a revision because this is where manuscripts stop feeling mechanical and start feeling emotionally alive. In the first workshop, we learned how to diagnose the manuscript and identify what exactly is not working instead of blindly editing line by line. The five revision layers that we learned were layer number one, core story. In this, we are going to be covering, in this, you will have theme, premise, and the emotional spine. Then comes layer number two, character. Character. This will have desire, fear, contradiction, and psychology. Then comes layer number three, structure and flow. Just a second, I need to admit a couple of people. Hi guys. So I have already started actually because the recording had started at 5 o'clock, and today's session is going to be a little uh it's going to go over 1 hour, so I've already started. You can join in now, and whatever it is that you weren't able to attend, you can always go back and watch in the recordings, which I'll be sharing. So I'm just going to continue. In case if you have any doubts, please leave them in the comments and I'll attend to them after the workshop because this is being recorded. Okay. And people usually keep on coming during the entire workshop. So I will be letting them in as and when they come. Okay. Okay. So I was just telling that in the first workshop, we had covered the five layers of revision, how I uh, have created this entire process of revision in which we divide the entire manuscript into five layers. The first one covers core story. It is made up of the theme, premise, and the emotional spine of the story. Layer number two is the character. It will have desire, fear, contradiction, and psychology. Then comes layer number three, structure and flow, which has plot, pacing, and escalation. Then comes layer number four, scene, purpose. It has tension, progression, and emotional movement. And then comes layer number five, language and execution. This contains prose, dialogue, rhythm, and clarity. In the second workshop, we looked at the larger architecture of the entire story. We covered structure, plot movement, pacing, and escalation. That is essentially our third layer. Now, today, we are taking one step further into the revision process and we are moving into the emotional experience of the novel. Because at the end of the day, readers do not fall in love with the structure of your book, they fall in love with what the story makes them feel. One thing I want to clarify before we begin is that these layers are not isolated from each other. Now, before that, in today's session, we are going to be covering two layers, not one, but two. That is layer number two, character, and layer number four, scene, purpose. Now, as I was saying, these layers are not isolated from each other. A pacing problem may actually be a character problem. A scene problem may actually be an emotional problem. And a dialogue problem may actually be a subtext problem. And this is exactly why revision feels so complicated because manuscripts behave more like complete living organisms with complex systems rather than separate compartments. Now, In workshop number 2, we focused heavily on layer 3, structure and pacing, because if the skeleton of the story is collapsing, emotional scenes alone cannot save it. But now we are coming into layer 2 and layer 4, which is where the reader's actual emotional immersion is created. Remember, a perfectly structured novel can still feel dead. This is probably one of the biggest realizations writers have during revision. You can have a solid structure, a very good pacing, extremely polished prose, and very interesting premise. And yet, your manuscript can feel flat. Why? Because technically functional scenes are not necessarily emotionally immersive scenes. A lot of manuscripts today are readable, but very few are emotionally unforgettable. And obviously, this is also due to the fact that a lot of writers are increasingly using AI to write their novels, and they do not put in the work that is required to create a novel from scratch. This is why the manuscripts, even though they feel readable, they are completely lacking on the emotional front. And usually, the difference can be seen in the emotional layering, the psychological realism, the subtext, the contradiction, vulnerability, and emotional movement inside the scenes. And not just what happens externally. Now, let us look at the difference between a story and emotional experience that the reader craves. In story, we have what happens, but its emotional experience is what the reader feels. In story, we have plot events, but their emotional experience is basically the emotional tension. We have information, but its emotional experience is going to be immersion. We have dialogue, but the emotional experience is going to be the subtext of that dialogue. Then in the story, we have action, but it is the psychological movement that creates the emotional experience. You can have twists, but it will be the emotional consequence of those twists that is going to create the emotional experience for you. I want you all to remember. In fact, kind of you need to write it down on a piece of paper and put it wherever it is that you write or work on your manuscript. Readers remember feeling more than facts or structure or your plot or anything else is going to fail. And if you somehow nail this, you somehow manage to evoke emotions in your readers, you've won. So, this actually is because owing to the fact that readers rarely remember books scene by scene, even though we write it like that. Okay. Readers usually remember the emotional residue they felt. They remember the dread they felt, the heartbreak, the yearning, or maybe the discomfort, the emotional tension, the grief, or the obsession, or the intimacy. This is why sometimes people forget entire plots but still remember exactly how a novel made them feel years later. And this is also why some technically weak novels still become wildly beloved because emotionally they connected. Whereas some extremely beautifully written novels may feel cold despite being objectively polished. Now, let me tell you why most revisions fail. Most writers revise prose, the grammar, descriptions, they work on the pacing or their wordings, but they often do not pay any attention to the emotional movement, the character psychology, the tension in the scene, the subtext in the dialogue, and even the entire scene, Then also the emotional escalation. This is one of the reasons many revisions don't actually improve the manuscript. And writers can spend months rewriting the sentences or polishing the prose or cutting the adverbs and improving the descriptions, but the emotional core of the scene remains unchanged. And readers don't disengage because of a couple of weak adjectives. They disengage because emotionally nothing is happening on the page. The scene may be conveying information which might actually be useful in the plot. More often than not, most of the writers add information that is not actually of any use in the story. It is just in their heads, they think that the information might be useful to the reader, but many times it happens that the information can be either presented to the reader in some other way, or it is not required at all. So the scene may be conveying information, but it is not creating emotional friction, and that is a very big problem. Today, we will learn how to deepen character psychology, create emotional movement in scenes, write stronger subtext, increase emotional tension, make scenes emotionally memorable, and revise beyond the surface edits. So today's workshop is going to be extremely practical. We are not just going to discuss theory, we are going to actively diagnose why characters feel flat, why scenes feel emotionally empty, why dialogue feels too literal at times, and why emotional moments don't land. And then we'll revise them together. Because emotional revision is usually where manuscripts undergo their biggest transformation. Now, before we move forward, I want everyone to quickly think about a book you really love. Not just admire intellectually, but emotionally love. And ask yourself, what stayed with you? Why do you actually, what do you actually remember? A plot point or how it made you feel? Was it the exact mechanics of the plot? Or was it the emotional devastation, the longing, the atmosphere, the emotional tension between characters, the grief, the vulnerability, or the emotional ache? That emotional memory is what we are trying to create during revision. Now, let's move into the first major problem most manuscripts face during revision. Characters that technically exist on the page but psychologically do not feel real. The problem is usually not lack of backstory. It is lack of psychological depth. One of the most common pieces of feedback writers receive is that the characters feel flat. And the frustrating thing is that many times the writer has already done a lot of work on their characters. They've written the backstory, they've added trauma, they've added a lot of personality traits, they've even added emotional wounds, they've given their characters a lot of quirks. And they've even gone on to give their characters motivations. And yet, the character still does not feel real or alive. Why? Because readers do not emotionally experience characters through information. They experience them through behavior, emotional reaction, contradiction, avoidance, vulnerability, and emotional tension. In psychology, there's an important distinction between description and behavioral manifestation. A person who is not psychologically understood because they say they are anxious, we understand anxiety through behavior. The big misunderstanding writers are prone to is Information is not equal to depth. Many writers, they download a lot of CPS, character profile sheets, from online resources, even from my own website many times, and they work on the sheets, and then they think that they've created the character, right? But what happens is it is at the end still information unless you really think about your characters and put them in scene and have them play out the scenes in different ways using different psychological techniques. Your characters will still feel flat, because just because you know enough information about your characters, or just because you feel you've conveyed enough information about your characters to the readers, it is not going to create depth. Knowing things about a character is not the same as feeling the character psychologically. This is one of the biggest misunderstanding in fiction writing. Writers often think if I explain the character deeply enough, the character will feel deep. But emotional depth is not created through explanation. You can know a character's childhood, their favorite food, their trauma, their fears, and their hobbies, and still feel completely emotionally disconnected from them. Why? Because readers connect psychologically through patterns of behavior under emotional pressure. This is also why in real life we understand more through how they react in different moments than through what they say about themselves. Now, let us quickly look at the 5 reasons characters feel unreal. Characters feel flat when they react only externally, or they want only the plot goal, or they lack contradiction, or the emotional register never changes, or their backstory informs instead of haunts. And trust me, almost every manuscript suffers from at least 2 or 3 of these. Let's look at them one by one. Problem number 1: the character reacts only externally. They can be angry, they can be sad, they can be shocked, they can be happy. Real emotion is rarely this direct. One of the clearest signs of emotionally flat writing is emotionally literal behavior. The character is angry, so they shout. The character is sad, so they cry. The character is nervous, so they tremble. But psychologically, human emotion is rarely this straightforward. In psychology, we often talk about defense mechanisms, right? These are unconscious emotional strategies people use to protect themselves from discomfort. For example, people use humor to mask insecurity, or they use anger to mask grief. They intellectualize pain. Uh, there's emotional withdrawal. They use sarcasm as protection, and they pretend not to care. That is why emotionally immersive characters often do not react directly, at least not always. Let's look at this example. We have a flat version and we have a better version. In the flat version, I'm angry at you. She said angrily. Or maybe the narration will just simply say she was angry at him. See, if you're looking at plot progression, it is okay to have something like this, something like the second sentence, that is, she was angry at him, if you are leading up to something. But if you're not, and that is what the core of the scene is in that particular scene, you are not going to be showing it like this. Instead, what is better is forget it. She turned around and began reorganizing books that did not read reorganizing. Subtext. We are going to be talking about subtext later, but subtext is something that you all need to put more into practice when it comes to trying to bring your characters to life on page. The second version here creates psychological realism because the emotion leaks sideways through behavior, and readers enjoy interpreting emotion. Emotionally immersive fiction allows reader to participate psychologically rather than merely receive information that the author is trying to give them. Problem number two, the character wants only the plot goal. Plot goal is not an emotional need. If you want to learn more about it, I will later in the evening share a link to one of my earlier webinars. It is a pretty old webinar, but I had gone in detail and covered Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. And we've covered a lot of ground in that when it comes to the needs of a character. But plot goal is never one of them. So I'll share that link, just go through it. It's extremely good for characterization. Uh, and also, you just don't need it only while writing a book, you also need it while revising the book. So, this is one of the most common structural and emotional problems in most of the manuscripts that even I work on. Writers confuse external objective with internal emotional hunger. The plot goal may be solve the murder or stop the war or win some competition. But psychologically, the character may actually want validation or control or belonging, or maybe they are seeking forgiveness, safety, intimacy, or maybe trying to find meaning of their existence. And often the emotional need matters more to the readers than the external goal itself. For example, the external goal could be solve the case, but the internal goal of your lead or any of the characters can be to prove she is not a failure. The external goal can be save the marriage, but the internal need is feel worthy of love. The external goal could be win the election, but the internal need will be to be respected. The external goal can be to find the killer, but the internal need will be, say, regain control after trauma. These are two very different things. And the day you are going to grasp the difference between the two and you start working on these two things separately while trying to keep them in sync on the page, you will have an absolute bang on character. Remember, emotional stakes create reader investment. This is why two stories with the same plot can feel completely different emotionally. Because what matters is not just what the character is doing, but what emotional hunger is driving them underneath. This emotional layer is what creates actual depth. Without it, characters feel functional rather than realistic and relatable. Problem number three, the character lacks contradiction. Remember, real people are extremely inconsistent. This is where psychology becomes incredibly useful for characterization. In psychology, there's a concept called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance refers to the emotional discomfort humans experience when two opposing emotional realities exist simultaneously. For example, there can be love as well as resentment. There can be desire, but there can also be fear at the same time. There can be grief, but also relief. There can be vulnerability and also avoidance. And honestly, human beings are full of contradiction. Just look around you. You interact with so many people, especially your family members and extremely close friends, and just give this thing a thought. Someone may crave intimacy but completely fear dependence. They can deeply love someone while also resenting them And just imagine if you're trying to weave this into a story, it's going to give you such good, amazing emotional connect for the reader. They may want success while fearing visibility. They may seek connection while pushing people away. That contradiction creates realism because readers will be able to relate to your characters then because they themselves feel this contradiction inside them. One dimensional characters feel emotionally artificial because real people are rarely emotionally coherent. ऐसा होता तो बात ही क्या थी? Remember, contradiction creates complexity, and complexity is what we are after because human brain is an extremely complex organ. Now, let's look at this chart. For outer trait, we can have someone funny, but their internal need, it's not internal need, it's inner contradiction. Okay. So the inner contradiction can be that they are lonely. Someone can be outwardly very independent, but their inner contradiction is going to be that they're terrified of abandonment. Outwardly, they can be very charming, but from the inside, they can be emotionally avoidant. Outwardly, they can be extremely protective, but inwardly, they can be extremely controlling. Now, one of the ways of showing this contradiction very nicely is to show how a certain character behaves differently in different environments because mostly we people show our outer traits to the people who are not very close to us, and we only show or we can only the people who can notice our inner contradictions are the people who are extremely close to us. So you can always put your character in such situations where you are not telling the reader about the contradiction, you're showing them that contradiction. This is also why emotionally layered characters feel so unpredictable in the most compelling ways. Because psychologically, people are messy. And that's where you get the connection to the reader. Problem number 4, the emotional register never changes. Authors use the same tone, the same reactions, and the same emotional energy for their characters. This is one of the reasons characters start feeling extremely repetitive because of the emotional monotony. The character is always angry, always sarcastic, always traumatized, always emotionally guarded. And you will not believe, you might think that you've added very complex personality traits to your character, but even when I look back, I actually made one of one of these mistakes in my own first book. And you know what, now I always remember, and now whenever I work on my characterization, I make sure that I'm not making that mistake. So just remember your characters, even if you have a character who's traumatized. This is specifically very true for trauma. If authors love traumatic characters for some reason, because obviously, because then you get a lot of ground to work with, right? You can add a lot of good backstory, you can add a good mix of personality traits. So what happens is authors begin with a traumatic character and their character is always traumatized. It feels like in scenes where the character can easily be laughing or just enjoying themselves, the authors try to show them being traumatized that time also, and that is what makes the character feel artificial. It is not something that the readers can point out consciously. No, no, never. It is just something that the readers feel on a very subconscious level. But psychologically, emotional expression changes constantly depending on, say, context or exhaustion or safety or intimacy or emotional triggers. People emotionally fluctuate all the time. Now let's look at problem number 5. Backstory informs instead of haunts. Strong writing lets trauma leak into behavior. You do not have to tell that your character is traumatized. You can just show it leaking into their behavior. Now, again, this is one of the biggest breakthroughs writers have during revision. A lot of manuscripts explain trauma directly, but psychologically, immersive writing shows trauma behaviorally. Behaviorally. Okay, I'm sorry. I've practiced for this workshop so many times, and this is one of the words where I had been fumbling badly. So I'm just gonna let it be. So instead of saying she had trauma, you may show your character constantly checking exits or over planning or having difficulty trusting silence or flinching at tone shifts or keeping emotional backup plans. Now, the trauma feels alive inside behavior. Now, let's have a look at this example. Actually, I had removed examples because the workshop's time was going way over. So I had removed the live examples that I had planned for today. So we are going to skip this part. Now, let's talk about subtext and emotional tension. If you guys want, I can always share scenes like we did for workshops 1 and 2. This week I did not get a lot of time, that's why I wasn't able to share a lot of exercises. But I'll share a couple of scenes and then we can work through those scenes. It'll actually be better if we do after the workshop so that you can apply what you've learned in the workshop into those exercises. Okay, so let's talk about subtext and emotional tension. The real scene is usually happening underneath the dialogue. One of the clearest differences between emotionally immersive writing and emotionally flat writing is subtext. In emotionally flat scenes, characters say exactly what they feel. But psychologically, as we have seen, human beings rarely communicate this directly. Most emotionally significant conversations are happening simultaneously on two levels: the spoken conversation and the emotional conversation underneath. And subtext lives in that hidden layer. Now, subtext is the hidden emotional conversation. Dialogue is on the surface and emotion is underneath that. Subtext is not about making dialogue confusing or cryptic. It is about emotional layering. For example, the conversation may appear to be about, say, dinner, work, traffic, a hospital visit, or maybe grabbing a cup of coffee. But emotionally, the real conversation may be about abandonment, guilt, resentment, attraction, power, fear, grief. Let me show you an example. With no subtext, I'm upset you forgot my birthday. Now imagine, no person is going to be saying like that, right? Okay, just imagine if someone extremely close to you forgets your birthday, what is going to be your reaction? Now, that is how your character needs to react. Okay, now with subtext, we can say, don't worry about it, it's just a date, right? The second version creates emotional participation because now readers instinctively sense hurt, disappointment, suppression, and emotional withdrawal without the character directly naming any of those emotions. And psychologically, this feels more realistic because humans constantly soften, hide, or redirect their emotional truths. अगर सीधे सीधे बात करते तो लाइफ में इतने प्रॉब्लम्स ही नहीं होते, राइट? So, people rarely say what they actually feel. This is one of the most important psychological truths for dialogue writing. People suppress emotion, they redirect emotion, they soften emotional truth. They joke through discomfort, they intellectualize their pain, they avoid vulnerability, they become passive aggressive, and they say practical things instead of emotional things. And when fiction ignores this complexity, dialogue begins sounding emotionally artificial. And if you're going to have emotionally artificial dialogue in your scenes, your scene is already not working. Now, just one second. I think I have one of the topics that I had removed from. Hmm. Now, let's look at why writers overwrite dialogue. This is one of the problems that completely ruins scenes. Writers often fear that the readers won't get it, or subtlety will be confusing to the reader, or the emotions that their characters are feeling need some explaining. So they end up over explaining. This is one of the biggest reasons dialogue becomes emotionally heavy handed. Writers become anxious that readers may miss the emotion, so they explain everything directly. But emotionally intelligent readers enjoy inference. They enjoy connecting emotional dots. And this is why restraint often creates stronger emotional impact than explanation. Now, here are 5 ways to create subtext. 1. Deflection. 2. Silence. 3. Topic shifting. 4. Contradictory body language. And 5. Dialogue with hidden meaning. Let's look at them one by one. First, deflection. Characters avoid the emotional truth. For example, are you okay? Did you submit the electricity bill? Deflection is incredibly realistic psychologically. People often avoid vulnerability by redirecting attention toward logistics or practical things. And suddenly the dialogue begins feeling emotionally layered. Now, right now, obviously, it's not making too much sense, but just imagine a scene where a couple, or maybe just two partners have had a very heated argument, and maybe they spent an hour not talking to each other, and they see each other after an hour, and then one of them asks the other, did you submit the electricity bill? Right now, see, there is tension, right? So there's your tension. This is why I'm actually not taking entire scenes, because scenes tend to go a little long, and then I also have to provide context, as I've seen in the last 3 workshops. So it becomes a little difficult to explain. Now, second is silence. What is not said becomes emotionally important if done correctly. For example, did he hit you? He waited for her to reply, but she kept folding the same shirt. This is actually a very good example. Silence is powerful because readers instinctively search for meaning inside absence, inside that gaping silence. An emotionally tense silence often carries more impact than dramatic speeches. But let's just remember not to overdo it in every second scene. The next one is topic shifting. Emotional avoidance disguised as conversation flow. For example, you never came to the funeral. Yeah, I was busy with stuff. How's your daughter doing? See, when characters abruptly shift topics, readers immediately sense discomfort beneath the surface. That discomfort creates tension. Then the next one is contradictory body language. Dialogue says one thing, but their behavior says something else entirely. For example, I'm not nervous. He dropped the lighter twice, or maybe, his hand is shaking, or he's fidgeting too much. This creates psychological realism because human beings constantly contradict themselves physically. Then comes hidden meaning, dialogue that means something else. For example, now again, here we are missing the context. I'm going to give it to you. The female says drive safe, but the actual meaning behind it is please don't leave me again. Now, for example, let's say it is happening after a particular argument, or maybe something big happened and the hero is walking away, or maybe the heroine herself is walking away, and the other person says drive safe. But here, if this tension has to be conveyed to the reader, you have to show it through body. Like this, there's so much potential here you can show it, right? I'm sorry, I cannot turn off my writer's brain. I'm just looking at it and I'm feeling like I can just write a scene right now. So, please bear with my overexcitement over scenes. So, what happens is you can show it through body language. You can show maybe a tear rolling down her cheek, or maybe, she's like, it may be a bit over dramatized, but this is how it is done. Maybe she reaches out with a hand when the other person is not looking. She's reaching out with a hand, and then she uh, balls her hand into a fist and keeps it beside her. No, let him go. See, so just with these two dialogues you've created and some body language, you've created so much emotional tension here, right? And trust me on one thing. If, as the author, you do not feel the tension in the scene, the reader is definitely not going to feel it. Now, this is where ordinary dialogue becomes emotionally loaded. Simple lines begin carrying emotional weight beneath them. So, why subtext creates tension? Because tension is created when emotion is restrained, blocked, or indirectly expressed. This is a psychological fact, and as writers, we are going to do what we always do. We are going to make use of all the psychological concepts and put it into making our characters more relatable to the reader. Emotionally explosive scenes are not automatically powerful. In fact, restrained scenes are often more devastating because the reader feels the pressure of what cannot fully emerge. Now, I'm just gonna digress for a second. Um, in case if you want to learn the art of subtext, I would strongly recommend that you read The Dutch House by Anne Patchett. Anne Patchett, maybe other books as well. I've actually read one more book by Anne Patchett, but that one did not hit me as hard as the Dutch House did. Um, Actually, I've been thinking about the Dutch House a lot lately. I've been planning to do a review on it. So anyway, but yes, see, it is quite literally impossible for me to be talking about emotionally powerful writing and then not talk about something that hit me so hard emotionally. If you read The Dutch House by Anne Patchett, I think you will understand everything I'm trying to teach in today's session. Okay? So do make a note of it and do give it a read. And if you do, then do let me know what you think about the book, because that book actually broke me so completely. It took me a very long time to get over it. And that kind of writing is so rare. It is very rare. And there is so much to learn from Anne Patchett's writing. Now, most writers, sorry, let's get back to this, right? Most writers write on the nose dialogue. That is what I call as the on the nose dialogue problem. Characters say exactly what they mean. For example, I feel abandoned because you prioritized work over me. No one's going to say that, because the problem is humans often, we often do not understand what is bothering me. Especially, I can, of course, just talk about myself, but sometimes It takes me days to figure out why am I feeling so irritated or angry with something and what is it that is bothering me, right? So imagine how can you have your characters just plainly feel one feeling and understand it so completely that they are able to tell it to someone else. No, 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 that does not happen. That never happens. So, we are going to use subtext here and make on the nose dialogue better. You always answer emails faster than my messages. See, actually, that was the trigger here in this scene. And obviously, we can have the character pinpoint that instead of saying that I feel abandoned because you prioritize your work over me, right? And then we can actually here also show a couple of more arguments that keep on escalating uh, throughout the book, where work is always at the center, right? Now, suddenly, then in dialogues like this with subtext, there is hurt, there's resentment, there's loneliness, there's emotional hierarchy. Everything exists beneath this sentence. Now, let's look at a very small example. You cut your hair. Yeah, it's shorter. That's generally what happens when you cut it. Can you feel a little bit of a tension here? Now, let's analyze this. Can you, okay, on the surface, the people in the scene are discussing hair, but underneath, what's going on? Can you tell me? Please reply in the comments, or if you want, you can unmute and speak too. I'm waiting for the answers, please. Everyone, please reply whatever it is that you feel. What do you think is the subtext here? I think the female is snapping a little bit. Why? What do you guys think? Come on, it's a very simple this thing. Dialogue exchange. Anyone? Maybe there's some unresolved breakup tension. There's a little bit of discomfort. Uh, there's also a bit of bitterness. There's some emotional distance, and there's definitely some history here at play. This is what emotionally layered dialogue does. It creates two simultaneous conversations. And when you do, or when you have this kind of conversations, the reader forgets that they're reading a book. They actually feel very involved in the conversation. And that is where you win as the author. So, while revising scenes, always ask yourself, what is this character trying not to say? This question alone can transform dialogue revision for you. Because once you understand what the character is suppressing, avoiding, hiding, or fearing, subtext naturally begins appearing. Remember, perfectly clear dialogue is often emotionally flat. This does not mean readers should be confused. It means emotional meaning should not always arrive in the most direct possible form. Readers should sometimes feel tension, implication, emotional uncertainty, discomfort, interference. That emotional participation creates immersion. Now, while on the topic of dialogue and subtext, I would like to recommend one more book to you guys. It's a fiction. It's actually a crime thriller, and a recent one at that. All the Sinners Bleed by S.A. Cosby. This book has such amazing dialogue that it kind of is a very good resource for writers. I've actually uh, put it in my video as well. It is one of the books that can actually be just read, enjoyed, and be learned from, because there's so much to learn. I have not read any book in almost, I think, last 2, 3 years that had such good dialogue in it. So, only for the dialogue, if you want to learn writing good dialogue and how the dialogue delivery feels real, then do read this book. Moving on, let's talk about why some scenes stay with readers, which is the third important topic of today's workshop. At this point, we've discussed emotional depth, psychological realism, emotional movement, and subtext. Now we come to the final element. Why do certain scenes stay with readers forever? Because if you think about your favorite books, you probably don't remember every scene. But there are certain moments you simply cannot forget. For me, off the top of my head, it would be the moment Ned Stark was beheaded. In the book. I'm talking about in the book. It was absolutely devastating. And I did not see it coming because I had read the book almost, I think, 8 years before the series even came out. So no one was talking about Eddard Stark or Ned Stark that time. And I had no way of knowing what was going to happen. Internet पे उतना Game of Thrones के बारे में कोई भी बात नहीं करता था. So it was an absolute shock, right? So some moments stay with you. There are certain moments that you simply cannot forget. Why? Because those scenes created emotional impact strong enough to leave residue. Readers remember emotional bruises. They remember humiliation, yearning, betrayal, tenderness, dread, grief, vulnerability, and emotional rupture more than they will ever remember the plot mechanics. Readers remember emotional experience. The scene where someone waited and nobody came, a character almost confessed but stopped. Someone chose pride over love. Grief leaked into ordinary conversation. A betrayal emotionally shattered trust. Those are the scenes that remain with the reader. So, let's talk about the 7 elements of memorable scenes. Memorable scenes often contain these 7 things: emotional contradiction, vulnerability, irreversible realization, power shift, emotional restraint, moral comfort, moral discomfort, and unfulfilled longing. Now, let's look at them one by one. Element number 1: emotional contradiction. Wanting two opposite things simultaneously. For example, love and resentment, desire and fear, grief and relief, intimacy and self protection. This is one of the strongest emotional forces in fiction. When characters want When characters want contradictory things simultaneously, scenes become emotionally unstable in the best possible way. That instability creates intensity. Element number 2: vulnerability. Emotional exposure creates reader connection always. Readers emotionally connect when characters reveal something emotionally costly. Not necessarily through speeches or dialogue. Sometimes vulnerability appears through hesitation, awkwardness, failed control, emotional leakage, asking for help, trying not to cry, pretending not to care. Vulnerability creates intimacy between the character and the reader. Element number 3: irreversible realization. The character understands something they cannot emotionally unlearn. For example, he never loved me. I've become my I've become my father. She is going to leave. I cannot save this anymore. These moments become emotionally powerful because they permanently alter the character internally. The plot may continue, but emotionally something irreversible has shifted, and readers love these irreversible shifts. Element number 4, power shifts. Emotional control changes hand. For example, a character maybe enters in the scene uh, confident, and by the end of the scene, they leave emotionally exposed. Power shifts create emotional momentum. I'm not just referring to political or physical power here, but also, and more importantly, emotional power. Who is vulnerable, who is dominant, who's withholding, who's dependent, and who's emotionally exposed. When those dynamics shift, see, become extremely dynamic. Now, element number 5, restraint. Restraint is often more powerful than explosion. One of the biggest mistakes writers make is assuming emotional intensity requires dramatic expression. Because often the scene where someone says, okay, can be far more devastating than screaming, especially when the readers understand what the character is trying to suppress. Then comes moral discomfort. Readers become emotionally invested when emotions are ethically messy. For example, loving the wrong person, feeling relief after loss. This is actually one of the exercises that I was going to give this week. Feeling relief after some loss. This is so highly morally uncomfortable for most writers to write. But I'll tell you what, if you are able to get through it, you might just produce some of your best work. Then there's enjoying revenge, which a lot of, I think, romantasy authors are after. Then choosing self preservation over loyalty. This is also very good. Emotionally clean situations are often less memorable, but emotionally uncomfortable situations feel extremely real because people are faced with such uncomfortable situations too many times on a daily basis. People are morally contradictory, and memorable fiction often allows characters to behave in emotionally difficult ways. Then there is element number 7, unfulfilled longing. Longing creates staying power, especially when unresolved. One of the most haunting emotional forces in fiction is longing. Think of Wuthering Heights. And I'm not talking about the movie, I'm talking about the book. Not getting what is emotionally desired often creates stronger emotional impact than fulfillment because longing keeps emotional tension alive inside the reader. If you want to read a good book on unfulfilled longing, do check out Madeline Miller's Achilles Heel. Achilles Heel. Sorry, a Song of Achilles. I think, yeah, a song, Achilles. Song of Achilles, right? It is a beautiful book and it is about unfulfilled longing. You will actually appreciate the prose as well. Her dialogue is also pretty good. So do pay attention to the dialogue as well. And she also packs a lot of subtext. And also her characters are so good that inevitably you will fall in love with them. Another book that you can read is Circe, again by Madeline Miller. It is also very good. Actually, Madeline Miller is pretty good at creating amazingly realistic characters. So you can learn a lot from her books. Now, This brings us to the end of the 7 elements. Now remember, during revision, don't ask, does this scene work? Ask, does this scene leave an emotional mark on the reader? This one question changes the revision process entirely because many scenes are technically correct, but emotionally they're completely weak. And readers rarely obsess over technically competent scenes, they obsess over emotionally bruising ones. Now, let's look at a very simple example. Here's a functional version, I forgive you. And here's an emotionally memorable version. I wish you had been the kind of person I could forgive. The second line creates grief, history, longing, finality, and emotional consequence, all simultaneously. This is emotional density. Now, remember, emotionally safe scenes are often forgettable. A lot of writers subconsciously protect their characters from emotional discomfort. And in doing so, they are trying to protect themselves from the emotional discomfort. But memorable fiction often requires emotional exposure, emotional risk, emotional messiness, difficult truths, and unresolved ache. That discomfort is where emotional permanence comes from. I have a very good advice for you guys. Write a scene. Now, and I'm not talking about some manuscript that you're working on right now, because obviously the scenes are going to be according to the story that you're trying to say or tell in the story, in the manuscript. What I want you to do is basically free writing exercise. If you don't know what free writing is, you can check it out on my channel. I've done a video on that as well. But free writing is basically an exercise in which you put a timer of say 15, 20 minutes. I would suggest put it for 15 minutes and then just sit with a blank page, maybe on your laptop, or if you're comfortable with a pen and a paper, you can do that. For those 15 minutes, just write whatever comes to your mind. And for that exercise, take this as a prompt, okay? What you can do is simply think about the one thing that you absolutely do not want to feel. For example, um, maybe, for example, one of the things that I really do not like to, or maybe one of the situations that I would really never want to end up in is being in a social setting where a certain person is present, right? So for me, it is that. Maybe for you, it is something else. Maybe for someone, it is fear of public speaking or something. Just think about a scenario like that, like your absolute worst fear, okay? And write a scene, put your character in that situation and write a scene. And then see what kind of emotionally excellent writing you have after the 15-20 minutes timer. It is going to be so emotionally charged, the scene. See, this is why we say you can never actually take out the author from the character. A all the characters are actually a part of you only. So you need to realize some truths about yourself, the emotions that you try not to face, and then make your characters face them. That is going to bring out the best writing from you as a writer. Now, here's an exercise for you for your manuscript. This is another exercise. Uh, just go through your manuscript or just think about your manuscript after the workshop and think about which scene currently leaves the strongest emotional mark and why. I want you to think about it nicely and maybe I don't know how you plan your novels, uh, but a very good way of doing it is kind of creating a table, or maybe in a physical notebook you can just draw a table and keep a track of scenes, number them, label them, and kind of just make notes about them. This will really help you. In case if you haven't done this and this is not how you write, I would implore you to try this method. Maybe you, if you are comfortable with using Excel or numbers, you can do it on those softwares. If not, you can just create a simple table in Word or maybe just use a notebook. I personally use my whiteboard and I use these sticky post-its and I make scene charts. And after I'm done, I actually put those post-its according to the scene numbers in a notebook. So physically, I have my scene charts. Okay. So now what you need to do is just go through that scene list and just keep on marking. Actually, you can do a little system where you can give a rating of 1 to 5, 5 being the best, high emotions, 1 being the lowest, low emotions, and you can just rate your scenes according to emotional intensity. And then you know what you can do? You can just go back to the scenes which you have marked 5 or 4, go through them, appreciate what is good in them, take notes, and then go back to the ones, to the scenes that you have rated 1 or 2 and improve them. And I'll tell you what, this is going to open your eyes for your manuscript, and you are going to see how many scenes are even landing emotionally. Because if if you are a first time writer, you will have not more than 6 to 10 scenes that, even if that many, that actually land emotionally and have 4 or 5 rating. 5 is very difficult, but 4 definitely you can have. But it's not going to be more than 6 or 8 or 10 maximum. And how many scenes in total you have? You will be having at least 100 scenes. So you see the ratio. This is why your novel is not emotionally landing, and you will know how much work you have in front of you to do and where exactly. So now we've explored emotional depth, scene movement, subtext, and memorable emotional impact. Let's end the workshop with kind of a framework, which is actually a questionnaire that you can apply to your manuscript revision right away as soon as the workshop ends. Now, here is the emotional revision questionnaire that is going to help you in making sure that all your scenes are working properly. Now, remember, okay, I've added that code somewhere else. Okay. So Hmm. one of the biggest mistakes during revision is focusing too early on prose polish. Writers start rewriting lines, adjusting wordings, fixing grammar, improving descriptions before figuring out the emotional movement, the scene tension, the psychological depth of the characters, as well as the scene and relational dynamics. They forget it, or maybe they don't know it in the first place, that if the emotional design is weak, polished prose cannot fully save the scene. Now, here's the emotional revision questionnaire for every major scene. Question number 1, what emotion begins the scene? Question number 2, what emotion ends the scene? Question number 3, what hidden fear or desire is operating? Question number 4, what is not being said? Question number 5, what emotional shift occurs? Question number 6, what should the reader feel afterward? Question number 7, could this scene emotionally wound the reader more? Now, if you follow my advice and make a chart for your scenes, add a column for these questions and answer all these 7 questions for each and every single scene. It may feel like a lot of work, but trust me, you want to put in that work because it is going to be absolutely worth it. This is the framework I want you to begin using while revising your scenes. Answering these questions properly can radically transform your manuscript. Now, question number, okay. Okay, I don't have the separate slides for it, so I'm just going to be staying in on this one only. Question number one is, what emotion begins the scene? A lot of writers don't consciously identify emotional starting points. I know not writers, not only I know authors who've published multiple books, but still they do not know anything about the emotional starting and ending points of their scenes. Emotional movement requires contrast. So it's very simple. If there is not going to be any emotional contrast in the beginning and the ending of the scene, readers are not going to feel anything. If the character begins angry and ends angry in exactly the same way, emotional progression may feel static. Now, there is a way of graphing the emotional impact of your scenes, but that will be too much if I'll explain it to you right now, because I'll be needing more space, actually, more time to be explaining that. But in case if you guys are interested in learning plotting on a scene level, do let me know. I'll actually make a couple of videos and post them. But yes, I do graphing because graph helps. When you see it in front of you, seeing where the emotional tension is dipping, you can totally just go there and work on that scene and improve it. Now, question number two, what emotion ends the scene? Now ask, what has emotionally shifted by the end of the scene? Even subtle movement matters. Now remember, not every scene is going to have dramatic movements, and you don't even want to do that because otherwise it will be an overly dramatic book. You don't want to do that. But at least some subtle movement should be there. Maybe they go from confidence to a little bit of doubt, resentment to guilt, fear to attachment, hope to suspicion. Emotional transition creates narrative momentum. And if we've learned anything from life, from the workshops one, two, and three, is that we cannot stall the momentum of your narrative. The momentum is stalled, the book is going to feel boring to your reader, and the reader is going to mark it as DNF. Question number three, what hidden fear or desire is operating? This is where scenes gain psychological depth. Characters are rarely driven only by the visible conversation. Underneath the scene may exist fear of rejection, desire for validation, fear of abandonment, need for control, longing for intimacy, terror of vulnerability. And once you identify this layer, the scene becomes incredibly richer emotionally. Now, even though these are 7 questions, you are not always going to be needing them, because the more you work on your scenes with these 7 questions, the more, especially the first and the second questions, are going to sit in your subconscious, and you're going to develop an instinct that will help you to just have these two movements, the first and the second movement, automatically in your scenes. Okay, so then the natural first question will for you will become, what hidden fear or desire is operating in this scene? Okay, now, and once you identify the hidden fear or desire, the scene becomes incredibly richer emotionally. Then comes question number 4. What is not being said? This question immediately improves your dialogue, because emotionally immersive scenes are often built around suppression and avoidance, as we've just seen. The unsaid layer is frequently more important than the spoken layer. Then, question number 5, what emotional shift occurs? If nothing changes emotionally, the scene may feel stagnant even if information is exchanged. Something internally should move, and this is again very much related to the first 2 questions. Then comes, what should the reader feel after this scene? This is incredibly important. This It is one of the most powerful questions you can ask yourself while revising your manuscript on scene level. Because now you stop thinking only as a writer, you begin thinking as an emotional architect of your story. Should the reader feel dread, ache, suspicion, grief, tenderness, discomfort, emotional anticipation? What? Remember, strong revision is intentional emotional design. Now, question number seven. I actually wanted to say something. I thought I'll just finish the seventh question and then say it. Okay. Question number seven. Could this scene emotionally wound the reader more? This is one of my favorite revision questions because many scenes stop too early emotionally. As we've seen in workshops 1, 2, and 3, many times what writers think is a full-fledged scene is actually just a part of a scene because you don't need that to be a full scene in itself. It can actually serve as the beginning of the next scene. So it is very important to know that you are not stopping your scene too early emotionally. Writers often protect, as we've discussed, the character, the reader, and themselves. But memorable fiction usually pushes slightly deeper emotionally. And I'm not at all talking about melodrama, I'm talking about emotional precision. Now, let's see how we can apply the framework. Again, I have a example scene, but I cannot get into it because I have a meeting in the next 15-20 minutes that I really need to attend. So as I said, uh I will be sharing a couple of scenes after the workshop on which we all can work together. Okay? Now, remember, the real purpose of revision is not making the manuscript perfect. Revision is making the emotional experience intentional, working on the emotionality of the manuscript. Once you start following this particular advice, it will change everything for you as a writer because perfection is impossible, but emotional intentionality is achievable. Okay. The thing that I had wanted to say earlier was that you might think that I'm covering so many topics in 5 workshops only for just revising your manuscript. And it's too much work. But you know what? It is too much work because when the writers don't put all this work into revision, that is when the books get rejected by publishers. But worse, they publish the book anyway, and then the book fails to impress or entertain the readers. And that is when the writers regret not working on their manuscripts, not putting all those hours in revision and just going with maybe the first or the second draft and publishing it. So, trust me when I say you need to put in all this hard work in order to make sure that your manuscript is the best possible version of itself. Now, here's your final takeaway from today's session. Great scenes are not built on plot, dialogue, or prose. They are built on emotional consequence. At the end of the day, readers stay because they emotionally care, not because every sentence is beautiful, not because every plot beat is technically correct, but because something inside the story emotionally moved them. So, before we close today's workshop, I want to leave you with one final perspective on revision. Stories are always remembered emotionally, not structurally. A lot of writers think revision is primarily about fixing mistakes. But in reality, the deeper you go into storytelling, the more revision becomes about weaving in emotional consequences into your draft. And with this, I'd like to end this session. Thank you so much for joining today's workshop. I genuinely hope this changes the way you look at revision and emotional storytelling. And now I'd love to open the floor for questions, discussions, or even specific scene related struggles that you may be facing in your own manuscripts.